everybody. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. It's great to have you here. It's the first talk of the semester. We do this every Monday from 3 to 4, so hope you'll find your way here multiple times. I'm going to just tell you, because some of you might be new to this, that so the Mitchell Center, the sustainability part, everybody knows who Senator Mitchell is pretty much, but for us it's kind of the intersection of nature and society, and the goal of kind of sustainable development and the kind of science or research we do on sustainability is to improve human well-being, including the reduction of poverty, while protecting the environment. How do you kind of get both of those things right? Not at all easy. I don't think it's ever really happened well on our planet yet, and so we still have some work to do. But creating a sustainable future, whatever you might call that, definitely requires the ability to work together in many different senses. And we think of the Mitchell Center as kind of a practice space for how to do that, and in multiple senses. So students and faculty often come together in this building and kind of spreading out from here to figure out how to bring the different kind of knowledge and expertise they have together. Sometimes we call that interdisciplinary collaboration. It's not as easy as it sounds. In fact, I need a lot of hands to count on all the failures I've seen of trying to do this all over the world. It just doesn't come easy. So it's kind of like how the whole can be more than the sum of the parts of different kind of knowledge and know-how. We've been practicing this for a while. More than 30 different academic disciplines have worked on things, everything from archaeology out to zoology, so a lot of different fields. We've had lots of different partners that we work with, and that's because at the end of the day, as important as maybe universities and colleges and institutions of higher ed are, they're not going to change the world on their own. They're going to have to work with a lot of people who basically live and breathe and are doing all the great work off campus. So we partner with them. So far we've had about 700 students, graduate students, maybe 200 and 500 undergraduates, 200 faculty from a zillion different fields. We've created a network of 18 institutions of higher ed across New England, not just in Maine. And so this is a very active kind of think and act tank, if you will, for how to go out and tackle these problems. What happens on Mondays from 3 to 4 is just one illustration or one piece of the puzzle, where we have folks come in to talk about their work, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, kind of where they're stuck, where they're making great progress. And so lots of students and faculty want to talk here and will this semester how to use their knowledge and experience really to make a difference in the world. That's a big motivation for a lot of the people who work with the Mitchell Center. But what if it turns out that the real obstacle to making a difference in the world isn't just that you're trained as an economist or a civil engineer or a wildlife biologist or a rhetorician, but that it's about the challenge of figuring out how to work together. And I don't just mean within a university, I mean out in society. So if politics is the art of making decisions together, maybe we need to focus greater attention on improving how we make those decisions. And I'm not just making this up. I hope you're noticing in the news that it looks like we could improve on how we make decisions together in our society and in a lot of other parts of the world. So interestingly enough, there's a lot that gets in the way of getting better at that. One of the things is that what I would just call differences. Differences among people in attitudes, preferences, values, belief systems, worldviews, identities, and depending on which social scientist or people from the humanities you talk to, they kind of parse that space in different ways, but all those differences are way important. And interestingly, so how do we overcome difference? How do we work across difference? There's whole fields that actually spend their time thinking about this, many different fields. So we're really lucky today that we have an expert in one of them, but there's a field called deliberative democracy that got going, I think, maybe 30 to 40 years ago. There's something called multi-stakeholder conflict resolution that people work in that space and wear a name tag that says that's what they do. We sometimes talk about our role at the Mitchell Center as being an honest broker that kind of facilitates, mediates, helps with conflict resolution. which after all, if you know anything about Senator Mitchell, you know that's kind of a key part of his life and work, right up to the present day. And oh, before I forget, as you see these things going by about various things going on, one of them is that, 2 weeks from this Thursday, right over there in Houck Auditorium, he'll be giving a talk called Healing Our Democracy. And believe me, this will be a pretty interesting talk, there you go, about his view about this. He often gives talks about his experience in Northern Ireland or in the Middle East or, being the Senate Majority Leader. This is kind of about how to tackle these problems right here in Maine. So it'll be quite interesting. I don't think he's ever given a talk quite like this before. But today, almost as a preview for Senator Mitchell, I guess, we're very fortunate to have an expert in our midst in Quixada Moore-Vissing. I love it that she calls herself a civic researcher and community engagement designer. I didn't even know there were things like that. Why didn't I know that when I went to school so I could become that? You don't even want to know what I accidentally became for a while. So, among other things, we do a lot of teamwork. In other words, faculty and students connect with stakeholders. We've done 50 projects so far, every possible kind of sustainability thing in every part of the state and beyond. We probably should have had a civic researcher and community engagement designer on every one of those teams. We just didn't know it. So I'm not sure there really is a straight and narrow path to that kind of expertise. It doesn't look like Quixada found the straight path there either. She has a PhD, though, in education from our sister land grant, University of New Hampshire, a master's in communication, which is very relevant, as some of the people in the audience who have similar degrees know, from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and get this, a bachelor's in literature and the avant-garde from Boston University. So she's lived a number of places, including UNH, where she did her PhD, but she's recently arrived in Maine, down in Mid-Coast, and she's already being contacted because of her expertise in civic research and community engagement by communities. We get contacted at least once every few weeks by somebody in the state trying to work on problems at the community level, and it's not working because people are pretty riled up, not getting along, and they're looking for help. And so it's great that people like Quixada are here. I was on one of these calls this morning with a select person from a town that you would all know, basically saying, totally stuck here, don't know what to do about this. So this is very relevant, and it kind of means if we hope to help these communities in other ways, we've got to figure out how to do this too. So I'm looking forward to Quixada's talk. I won't do the whole thing, but the first part of it is ditching the divide, so you get the idea.
Okay. David, thank you so much. I want to thank both David and Linda Silka. Over the past year, we've been getting to know each other, and I'm so excited by the work that you're doing here at the Mitchell Center. We were just talking in a meeting before this how this is a truly special place. There's not places like this everywhere. So you're really lucky, students, that you have this resource and community and faculty that you get to come and partake. And I'm honored to be I didn't realize I was your first talk, so it's a true honor. So today I wanted to just share an outline of my presentation, and then we'll jump in. So I'll start with defining what healthy local democracy is and talking a bit about the benefits of healthy local democracy. And then I'll share 8 ways to cultivate local democracy. And really, I'm hoping that everybody can walk away with something that they can actually do. So I've tried to keep this very like doability focused. And I will also share a case study of a community called Pittsfield, New Hampshire, where you really see local community building to support healthy democratic life. So that's kind of the agenda for today. So before we jump in, yeah, some of you may feel like this comic illustrates some familiar dynamics right now. As you are aware, I'm sure, American political polarization hasn't been as tense in the United States as it was since before the Civil War, when our country was literally split into 2 countries. So I was walking my dog the other day, and I ran into this couple, and they were saying to me how they couldn't even stand to read the news anymore because it was just so stressful to think about these political conflicts taking place every day. It was exhausting. And I think a lot of people feel this way. In the past decade, people's trust in the government has declined, as evidenced by government shutdowns. Our inability to collaborate has created major impasses in democratic life. And a recent Pew study identified a perspective, finally, that both parties share, which is that Republican and liberal voters can't agree on any basic facts. So this political polarization really goes on to affect our communities. Bill Bishop theorizes in a book called The Big Sort that people are now living more frequently in neighborhoods with others who look like them, vote like them, make similar income to themselves. So we're fragmenting from each other. And as national tensions enter local politics, people may decide to withdraw rather than subjecting themselves to volatile interactions with their neighbors. But as we close off to each other, it's creating larger misunderstandings and even encouraging discrimination to thrive. And it's making us feel alone. So the rate of people who feel lonely has actually doubled since the 1980s, and 40% of adults now feel alone. And this can affect people's health. One study found that loneliness is actually as deadly as cancer for people. So I wanted to read a quote by Parker Palmer, who I think really summarizes how I feel about these issues. And he said, "No matter how jaw-dropping or morally offensive I find some people's convictions, I must learn how to speak up in the civic community without denying my opponents their humanity and further poisoning the political ecosystem on which democracy depends. Despite our sharp disagreements on the nature of the American dream, many of us on the left and on the right and in the center have at least this much in common: a shared experience of heartbreak about the condition of our culture, our society, our body politic. That shared heartbreak can build a footbridge of mutual understanding on which we can walk toward each other." So today, that's really what I want to explore is building this mutual footbridge. I think for most of us, when we think about our communities, we don't want these national tensions present. We want to get along with our neighbors, even if they think differently than us, because we see them all the time. Our kids go to school together. We see each other at the grocery store. So there's an emergent movement to building local democracy, and much of this is what communities have been doing for decades, but the idea is to focus on cultivating communities that can handle conflict in civil ways, encouraging participation from different groups, being equitable in the ways that decisions are made, and really thinking about, as a whole, how the community can be engaged. So basically, we can reject the national political culture of polarization and hostility and choose a different path. So I wanted to before I talk about local democracy, I wanted to just make sure that we all understand what I'm talking about. So local democracy is as it sounds. So it's democracy in a town or a city or maybe in a region, or it can be a place like a college campus as well. So there can be a lot of different ways that you build local democracy, but we're talking more about localized stuff than at the state or national level. And for people who are affiliated with the campus, I really encourage you to think about both like the community you have on campus, as well as community meaning the Orono community, or even other communities in Maine that you might be able to partner with and bring some good to. And what I would say about local democracy is that when there is enough pockets of local democracy, so when we've got Orono, Augusta, Fort Kent, Millinocket, Biddeford, all practicing strong local democracy, then we start to have a healthier state democracy. And then if we have healthier state democracy, I'm hoping that we start to have a healthier national democracy. So that's kind of the way that I think about these issues. Okay. So I wanted to just talk a little bit more about what a healthy local democracy looks like. So the U.S. Census, has an American Community Survey civic supplement, which you can learn important data about national and statewide civic life. And there's an organization called the National Conference on Citizenship out of Washington, D.C., and they actually help states to pull their statewide civic data from the census and then compare it to the national data. So, and they call this the Civic Health Index. So you can see I wrote New Hampshire's in 2012. And Maine has actually never done one, but you could. It's possible to do one. It does cost some money to do it and things, but it's a really helpful tool to just know, like, what is the picture of civic life in our state. And so I wanted to define civic health. So civic health is really the way that residents in a community participate in civic activities that strengthen social capital, enhance interconnectedness, build trust, help each other, talk about public issues and challenges, volunteer in government and nonprofit organizations, stay informed about their communities, and participate directly in crafting solutions to various social and economic challenges. So examples of how the U.S. Census measures this, they pull voting data, charitable giving data, volunteering. They look at public meeting attendance, public meeting leadership, how often people talk to their neighbors, if they talk about politics at the dinner table. So there's all these different indicators that you can look at to kind of get a picture of civic life. And so that's, like, when we talk about healthy democracy, that's the kind of stuff that I think makes up healthy democracy. But I want to talk about how do we actually get to that, right? Because it's great to talk about these ideals, but what are the steps where we actually access healthy local democracy? So this is a diagram. I didn't make this. This is by my colleagues Matt Leininger and Tina Nabatachi, and it uses this term called public participation. But I think that really this is a way where we can understand healthy democracy. So I'm wondering if this laser pointer works. No.
Is it the top little thing?
Yeah, look at that. All right. So you have here you have direct participation and indirect participation. And direct participation is when citizens, and when I say citizen, I'm just saying sort of generally people who live in a community. They don't have to be necessarily like a formal citizen of the United States, although they could be. But with direct participation, citizens are personally involved and actively engaging in providing input, making decisions, and solving problems. In indirect participation, citizens basically elect someone else to represent their point of view or give money to an organization that then goes out and does work to represent their point of view. Okay? So today we're not really going to talk as much about indirect participation, but I do think that's a part of democracy and it's important. But we're going to look more at direct participation. And then out of direct participation, you've got conventional participation. And this is really like, sorry, it's hard to hold the pointer there, so I'll go back and forth. But this is really like the status quo of most public meetings. So if you've gone to a school board meeting or a town council meeting or even watched like Congress on TV before, that's usually how they run meetings. So oftentimes you have a predetermined agenda. The decision makers are maybe like up on a big stage or at a podium. The community is kind of sitting quietly, listening to the process. The group maybe follows something called Robert's Rules of Order. Does anyone know what this is? It's like, I second the motion, aye, nay, show of hands. Like, you guys have probably heard that kind of language before. And then the public usually only talks during something called public comment. So there might be like a microphone right there, and people come up and say their piece for a minute or two, and then they sit down. And generally there's not a lot of conversation, but it kind of depends on the meeting. So that's kind of conventional participation. And then you've got thick participation, right? So thick participation really is at its heart deliberative, which means that there's a lot of talk and conversation back and forth. So people come to share their experiences, consider relevant facts and values from multiple points of view. They listen and react to each other. They consider a range of solutions or policy options, and then they decide how they want to act. And when it's done well, this kind of thick participation tends to foster mutual understanding across perspectives, which then fuels potential for collaboration and innovation critical to tackling different hard-to-solve community problems. So examples of thick participation might include, and it's okay if you don't know what these are, but might include things like citizen juries, dialogue and deliberation between public leaders and citizens, or something called participatory budgeting. So we're going to talk more about what those things mean today. And then there's thin participation. So thin is faster and easier, and it really is a quick way to get like the opinion of a lot of people. So it might be something like a survey or a petition or doing like crowdfunding or crowdsourcing. So you've seen crowdfunding when you get like an email asking you to give $10 to blah blah, cause or something. And ideally we want thick and thin participation together, because thick participation can be kind of slow, but it can be really like rich experience, and thin participation is faster, but just gives us more like surface level kind of information. Okay. All right, so what I wanted to share are 8 ways that you can cultivate healthy local democracy. And I will kind of note when something isn't free, but I've tried to show mostly free things because I want these to actually be things that people can do rather than costly things. So one thing that's going on right now is an initiative called On the Table, and it was founded by the Chicago Community Trust, but it's happening around the country. And basically the idea is that you get together people who you don't know at a restaurant, and you talk about your community, and you talk about the assets in your community, and you talk about some of the deficits in your community, and you try to, kind of identify things that you could do. And people tend to like it because there's food involved, which is always a pleaser. And then a couple other organizations. The Orton Foundation is actually doing work in Maine with an initiative called Community Heart and Soul. And really those are like a community visioning process. So it starts with a bunch of residents telling stories about their community, and then kind of identifying visions for the future of their community, like past where they might want to go. And then the community goes through this whole comprehensive process, looking at all the ideas, and then they decide to take action in some way. So like Biddeford, Maine has actually gone through this process. Rockland, where I live, is going through this process now. So, and there's more, I think maybe like Bethel, there's a few different communities in Maine that are doing this right now. And then there's something called Ben Franklin Circles. I'm working with this organization right now to do some work, and basically Ben Franklin had 13 virtues to live your life by, and so and they include things like humility, frugality, simplicity, silence, which sound kind of boring when you say them out loud, but actually there's like 13 sessions of conversations, and people come together just in their community to kind of talk about these ideas, but they can stimulate like a lot of personal reflection and a lot of community engagement. And with both the Chicago Community Trust and Ben Franklin, you can actually just download their guides and start doing them. With Orton Foundation, you would have to contact them, but it's still free to a community, but it's a bit more of a process. And the nice thing about the things that I've shared so far is that none of them are explicitly political. So if you want to build community but you don't want to have political conversations, things might come up in these conversations, but the goal is not to talk politics. But then if you want to talk politics, there are organizations that do that. So the Kettering Foundation puts out these, what they call issue guides, and they pick a bunch of different social issues, and then they show different perspectives, generally like a more conservative perspective, a more moderate perspective, and a more traditionally liberal perspective. and then people in a group can talk about it. So it's like a guided conversation. They also do have a lot of higher ed resources. And one thing that Kettering does is they'll train higher ed folks to establish centers for civic life, and it would be like a dialogue center on campus. So a couple different resources there, and then Everyday Democracy does national community engagement with a racial equity lens, and so all of their materials have a racial equity component, and then this is a guide that they created specifically on racism if you wanted to talk about racism. So you could go home tonight and download these and do a conversation tomorrow if you wanted to. And then there's an initiative called Maine Revives Civility. Has anyone heard of this in the room? A few people. So the National Institute for Civil Discourse does national work around building civility across politics. And they picked a few states to really go deep with the civility campaign, and they picked Maine as one of their states. So they have a pledge right now for individual people to take a pledge to be civil themselves, so you can take the pledge. They also have that same pledge that they try to get public leaders to sign on to. So like say you could ask your mayor, like, can you take a pledge to encourage civility in our community? And then they have community conversation guides if you want to try to have a conversation locally about civility or on campus or something. And again, all free. And then the last one I wanted to feature is something called the living room conversations. So these are how they sound. You host them in someone's living room, or if you're in the dorm, you could do it like in a common room. And the idea is that you intentionally ask people who are different political perspectives than yourself, so Republicans and Democrats and independents and moderates and everybody else are coming together in the same room, and you do talk politics. So the living room conversations have like a bunch of different discussion guides, everything from student loan debt to energy and the environment to legalize marijuana. I mean, like pretty much any topic that you want to talk about, they have a guide for. So if you want to, let's say you have like a neighbor who has a different political perspective than yourself, I mean, you guys could even like co-host in your neighborhood and just try to really, try to hear other people's perspective about these issues. So that was number one. Not all of them are that long. But the second way to cultivate local democracy is to support public leaders to learn new ways to engage the community. Public leaders, when they're engaging the community, in really positive ways, I think can set up community decision making that really includes the whole community and not just certain populations like those who are affluent or people who have lived there forever and are really connected with the town, but really try to include everybody in the community. But they need collaborative tools. They need processes that help them to build equity and figure out how to really give everybody in a community voice. And public leaders aren't necessarily trained to know how to do this. And so there's actually trainings that you can do with different organizations to learn how to do that. And so, you could either ask your public leaders to attend this or try to, build funding for your public leaders to attend some of these trainings. One organization that I don't have up here is Public Agenda. And Public Agenda does national trainings, like they'll do it in a different, like a city like Portland, and basically public leaders can come from around the state and just learn a bunch of different tools of how to engage community in various ways. There's also an organization called the International Association for Public Participation, and they actually have credentialing where you can get like credentialed as a leader of these processes. So like students, you could even do this now if you wanted to do it to sort of like build your professional portfolio. The National National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation has an annual conference, which is huge. It's like tons of people there, and it's really practitioner focused, meaning like anyone who wants to go out and just interact with communities and try to kind of lead these processes. And then the Deliberative Democracy Consortium is a little more like academic. So this would be like a university would probably join this group. and they're a little more talking about like deliberative democracy research and things. And then there's also opportunities in Maine, like there's a Lift 360 does leadership training in Maine. The Maine Community Foundation right now is doing some equity trainings for leaders around the state around racial equity. And then there's also like a lot of local stuff. So, you know, like I do this kind of trainings in my organization. New Hampshire Listens in New Hampshire will host trainings around public engagement, and you could travel to New Hampshire and do those or ask them to come here. And there's lots of different practitioners around the state that do this work. And the one I forgot is Sustained Dialogue. So Sustained Dialogue is also an organization that will work with college campuses to create dialogue on the campus. So lots of opportunities for dialogue and deliberation. So number 3 is around assessing local civic life and identifying focus areas of improvement. So earlier I mentioned the Civic Health Index, and the Civic Health Index is a really helpful tool to examine how a given state like Maine is doing around civic health, but it doesn't provide any local data. So, you know, if you wanted to know, say, how like Orono is doing compared to the rest of the state of Maine, right now there aren't the tools, but I've been exploring developing a localized civic health instrument that communities could use alongside the state and national indexes. And although Maine doesn't have an index yet, that's something that we could pursue. So, you know, it's an idea I have out there that I welcome collaboration on. But there's actually already existing measures out there to assess local civic life as well. So the National Civic League created a civic index, not civic health, civic index. I wish they would get more original with these names. But it actually is a tool that community stakeholders can use to evaluate how their community is doing civically on a bunch of different levels. And again, you can just download this from the internet. And then, you know, another avenue that I think is really exciting and perhaps a place for faculty and students to take some initiative is participatory research. So you could actually make assessing local civic life in a community like participatory action research project. And what participatory research means is that like the people who are leading the research, like a student or a faculty member, are working alongside the community, and that there's not a hierarchy, right? But that everybody is just kind of learning how to gather data and then gathers it and analyzes it together. So what I have up here is actually an example of something called Photo Voice. Has anyone ever heard of Photo Voice before? The Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, did this around food security to just show how people were hungry in their community and not having enough access to food. And this is actually not Virginia. I couldn't find a slide of theirs, but this is another Photo Voice project. But you can see how actually like people in the community go out and just take pictures with their phone or with their camera and then try to sort of document, you know, what the thing that they're seeing, how it fits into whatever trend you're studying. And so you can kind of use this as a way to stimulate conversation and you know, talk about policy outcomes and things. But the really neat thing here is that rather than having like just like the community leaders assess the state of civic life, like everybody in the community could do this and gather the data and be part of the process, which I think is pretty exciting. So number 4, has anyone ever seen one of these before in public before I die? Yeah. Another thing that we can do to cultivate local democracy is to try out alternatives to community engagement. Before I die is an example of engaged art. And the prompt here is before I die, I want to ... But you could easily change this to any prompt, right? So you could change this to what's most important to me about our local economy is ... and fill it in, you know. But this is a way to just kind of like let people start thinking about an issue and do it on their own time and for things to kind of linger in a community. And so art engagement can be really exciting. There's also citizen juries. So basically, some communities are doing a random sample of people and asking them to be on a jury where they actually like make decisions alongside a legislative body and they have equal decision-making power. So Australia has done this, and some communities in the U.S. have done this. Another thing that you can think about is like in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, they recently voted to replace the public comment section, the 2 minutes at the microphone, with actual deliberation with their public leaders. So you can actually change the structure of town meetings. But then I wanted to share a couple of other kind of fun things that are out there. So there's a couple apps. So Text Talk Act it has a couple versions. It's Text Talk Act, Text Talk Engage, Text Talk Vote. But it's apps about like voting, mental health, and basically you can like have a little group conversation. It gives you prompts of things to talk about on your phone. It shows videos and distributes information about a topic that you can kind of talk about, and it does some polling. So that's a great tool. And then I actually just designed an app which is kind of in the emergent stage called Colloquy. Colloquy basically uses kind of similar to Text Talk Act. It uses you can do polling and data sharing. It promotes like art engagement, one-on-one engagement, small and large group dialogues. But you can actually like create an Excel spreadsheet about whatever topic you want to engage about, and then we can just upload it and customize the app. And this isn't neither of these are costs. They're just apps that are out there. And then Purple States is actually doing individual documentaries with people about political issues. So they'll just ask them something like, tell us about your feelings about healthcare and tell a personal story about how your personal experience connects with how you feel about healthcare policy or something. And so, technically Purple States comes to communities and does this, but you could just do this on your own, right? I mean, you can just make videos and kind of use the Purple States model without even necessarily working with Purple States if you wanted to. And then there's something called participatory budgeting. So basically with this, a municipality gives a community a certain amount of their budget to decide themselves. So let's say they say, okay, 15% of the budget the community decides instead of the municipal leaders. And so people in the community talk and consider a bunch of options and then come to some consensus and they decide the budget instead. So there's a lot of we don't have to do things the way that we've historically done them is basically what I'm trying to say. Number 5 is to make a formal community commitment to better civic engagement. When we think about the way that town meetings are run, you can actually propose that you run them in a different way if you wanted to. So you can create a referendum or resolution. So my colleague Matt actually created a document called Making Public Participation Legal, where he just sort of modeled templates of language that you could sort of put into some kind of proposal in your community if you wanted to propose that a public leader might experiment with a more participatory method. Revive Civility also, again, has that pledge, which has similar kind of language for public leaders. And then another idea that I had recently is that in my town, Rockland, they passed a diversity resolution, which basically was just saying we embrace all different kinds of people and we're going to kind of formalize that as a community. But you could actually do that with civility or with engagement and just say we're a community committed to youth engagement, or we're a community committed to civility, and create a resolution that way. And then that adds a layer of formality and seriousness to the community's commitment to this kind of work. So those are some other things. And then I wanted to talk about higher ed just a little bit, since I am at the University of Maine today. So it's been really exciting in the past decade to observe a shift in higher ed towards establishing centers for civic engagement on campuses. And most of these centers tend to focus on a few things on expanding university community partnerships, on encouraging students to engage in service or volunteering experiences, service learning or volunteering, supporting faculty and engaged scholarship, and then cultivating civic skills in the classroom. And I can't talk about all the aspects of higher ed civic engagement, but I wanted to just kind of make one point today. What I see as emergent but hasn't been mainstreamed is the role of this civic participation in higher ed civic engagement, really encouraging people to share and listen, look at issues from multiple points of view, push back and forth ideas until they reach an outcome, and then presumably the outcome is better because you've gone through this process. So at Colorado State University, Martine Carcassonne has actually trained students as facilitators of community problems, working to build their capacity to lead public processes and really become the kind of leaders that we looked at earlier on in the slides that I hope to see. And the idea here is that you're not coming in as an expert telling the community what to do, but really students are becoming trained to help the community to uncover what the issues are, to identify assets and deficits, and really help the community to generate solutions. And at UNH, New Hampshire Listens, a civic engagement program there, does this work with communities, but also does this work with students, but also trains community members as facilitators of community problems. And so they have like this statewide network of both students and community members who can work together to do community problem solving. And they also, well, I'm going to skip that for now. But so what I want to close this slide is to encourage universities to think about the possibilities of thick participation and capacity building and engagement. And I encourage you to question, when you connect with communities, what is the goal? So if the goal is to address complex community problems, then I would say the emphasis can't just be on service. It really has to be on capacity building, because that's what makes it sustainable in scope. So the question I would ask is, how can you build capacity broadly of students to lead community processes, and specifically of the community to make change locally? And that's where I'd like to see our rhetoric shift. So are we done at 4 here? In here? Okay. So I'm going to skip my longer example. I have a longer case study, but I think I'm going to skip it. But I wanted to just talk about going deep with sustained local engagement. In Pittsfield, New Hampshire, where I wrote my dissertation, it was historically, in 2010, it was considered one of the lowest performing schools in the state of New Hampshire. It's a rural community, pretty low income community, and basically the superintendent decided to reach out to the community, envisioning the process of change, and to work with University of New Hampshire to create a series of community engagement processes aimed at really hearing the whole voice of the community in terms of what they wanted in their schools. And the outcomes ended up, Pittsfield has now been written up in the Atlantic Monthly as like a model of school change. The Department of Ed sent a representative to come and see the Pittsfield schools. And what has happened is that Pittsfield has built a bunch of school and community supports for engagement. So within the schools, they have a collaborative site council of students and faculty and community members, and they work alongside the school board to make decisions. And within the community, they have an organization called Pittsfield Listens that works to do really deep engagement work, including like civic education, so that people know how to use their school board, and also they have created these candidate conversations where when people run for local office, instead of standing up at the front of the room and doing their stump speech, that they sit in small groups and talk with community members about the issues. So I wish I could say more, but I just wanted to say there's a lot of different models out there on how you can go deep with engagement. And actually the Mitchell Center is doing a lot of this work, and you can learn from from people doing that work here. And the last slide, because I really want to talk to you. This is Pittsfield, but the last slide is I think to support civic engagement in Maine. We want to think about a statewide network. So I'm actually working right now to try to connect all the local work that's being done under one umbrella to create a space for training for local communities, for resource sharing, for collaboration, for coaching. So coaching would be like helping a community to sort of problem solve as they go through an engagement process, things like that. So I think I really want to talk to you, so I'm gonna stop there and just say, feel free to contact me and reach out. This is the only social media I'm on, unfortunately, but I am on LinkedIn. And I just wanted to say, I think we can build a healthy democracy. I think you can start this today, and we can mend our shared heartbreak. So I hope that you believe me, and that that you will do some of these things. So let me open it up for questions, because I want to hear from the crowd. Yeah.
Say first, thank you for this talk. Lots of great resources that I was not aware of. I just appreciate knowing about it. And I also appreciate your emphasis on civility. And my question is coming from doing a lot of work with clamming communities, where in some contexts there's a fair amount of civility, but where there's also a lot of conflict. Mm-hmm. And I see the limitations of conflict, especially for sustaining these shared decision-making processes over time, but also sometimes see some benefits to conflict. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your perspective on conflict and what kind of role conflict has in local democracies.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. So I think that sometimes, and I'm not saying you're having this misconception, but I think sometimes when people hear civility, they feel like, so we can't disagree, like, we just have to be really polite to each other, like, that doesn't sound good to me, and that's I think that's not the case. I'd say with civility, it's great to disagree, but you just try to do so in a respectful way, right? Where you're listening, you're asking questions, etc. But yeah, I mean, conflict has a huge place in actually community transformation, because it can be a really generative moment. But I think the important part to kind of remember is the reason why as communities and for public leaders we really want to support people with these kind of civic skills is that conflict can be really scary when you don't know what to do with it, right? And so I think the tendency can be for people to be like, okay, everybody cool down, like let's get out, let's go for a walk, like, and not actually like get into the conflict. But sometimes then it never gets resolved, right? You never move past it, and so we need to not be afraid of conflict. But I think that's where a couple things that I mentioned probably too quickly come into play. So like with coaching, so if you have people who are more experienced, have some experience with civic engagement, when a community is like moving into a conflict situation, you can talk with and be coached like a sport, right? Where you think about like what are all the ways that I could actually approach this conflict and be prepared with a set of tools when you walk in the door. I think that also having trained facilitators who can be neutral is a tough word because I don't know if anyone can ever truly be neutral, but at least be impartial is really helpful, right? Where you have someone who can make everybody feel safe in a conversation, because sometimes when we don't have facilitators and we've got like really passionate people in a room, then things can go south pretty fast. So I guess those are some of my thoughts about conflict, but it's not something to shy away from by any means. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So I'm curious, I love this idea of focusing on local communities, but I wonder if you have identified sort of a sweet spot in terms of community size where you see this like greater potential for action. So right now, for example, I live in Old Town, which is not a very large community, but I used to live in Brooklyn, New York, and that was my community. But I could see very different potential and limitations, you know, in terms of size. But is there a place where this works best, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, size is an issue. So I think that if I was going to approach this process in a place like Brooklyn, I would look to neighborhoods, because you do want to when you're trying to engage like hundreds of thousands of people potentially, it gets pretty overwhelming, right? So I think there are lots of engagement processes where you do work in cities, but I'd say then you either pick a neighborhood of the city, or if you wanted to do like all of Brooklyn, then you'd have the processes, like public engagement processes, go down in different neighborhoods, and then maybe have like some event that brings all the information together in some way. But it would be difficult scale wise, in my opinion, to try to do something fully citywide. Although some of these lend itself more than others. Like On the Table would lend itself to like a whole city, right? Like you could easily do that all across the city. If you really wanted to go deep with a conversation about, I don't know, public transportation, you might have to do that at a smaller scale, or in the neighborhood pockets. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
I wonder conversely if there isn't too small, where people
Sure.
are too interconnected with each other's lives, and it's hard to separate to maintain, whatever distance you need maybe to be a little bit civil.
Yeah, I mean that can come up especially in small towns where people have years of history, right? Like since like elementary school. Yeah, so I think in that case you can still. I think it's still possible. Like I have seen these processes work in pretty small towns, but you probably then might need an outsider to help you facilitate, because so sometimes I think you can make a case for the community sort of managing its own process, and sometimes you might need someone external, and that may be a case where everybody just has too much history for any one person to take leadership, and you need somebody else to help. Yeah.
I was wondering about if you had any ideas on how to keep these kinds of civil situations, making sure that people feel justified in whatever like anger or grief they may have for a particular social movement, and how to create a civil politics that doesn't shy away from justifying people's emotive reactions.
Sure. Yeah. Well, a couple of thoughts about that. So first, I do want to say that sometimes it's not time for these kind of processes, and sometimes it's time for healing, right? So, like, I got approached right after the St. Louis protests and riots last year over police shooting of a African American man who was like acquitted, and they wanted to do community engagement, and I said, right now you need to do community healing. Like this is not actually the time. I don't think people are in a mental space where they can do that. So sometimes the timing isn't right. Sometimes the timing is definitely right. And I think that sometimes it's helpful to establish ground rules. And maybe in the ground rules you make the space for people to feel passionate, but to keep it speaking for themselves and not to try to start like lashing out at other group members, if there's someone who has a different perspective. So that can help. Sometimes I think that with the trained facilitator you do have to take a pause. So even though I just said you shouldn't shy away from conflict, I mean sometimes like I was facilitating this one conversation, and it was about the opioid epidemic, and one woman in the group had lost her son to opioid overdose, and she was just, it was getting too hard of a conversation. Like, we needed a break. She was too upset, and the group wasn't able to really talk anymore because everyone was just feeling for her, and so no one wanted to sort of challenge her perspective in any way. So sometimes you need to take a pause. Sometimes I also think it may be the time for activism and not for engagement. And so something I didn't talk about today, just because I didn't have time, is that there's also a space for activism in democracy, and that may mean hitting the streets because you care about an issue, and maybe like at that point in time, that's where you want to put your energy in, not in a collaborative process. My hope is that you can do both, that you can see the value of talking across difference, and then maybe also go and do your activist thing, and that you can kind of separate those things in your mind. But I never want it to feel like if we're engaging in these processes, we can't have the really strong feelings that we're feeling, because that's also part of our democratic right, to be able to have those feelings and to act on them, and hopefully in peaceful ways. Yeah. Yeah, please.
I liked one of the slides that you had where Maine was chosen for one of these, one of the analysis, and it said at the bottom that most argue, like, when you're trying to have a discussion or a conflict kind of evolves into arguments and rudeness, and that's when people kind of get stuck in their own ways, and it's more about proving the other one wrong and you being right and changing their opinion instead of actually agreeing on something. But what do you do, I guess, from a political standpoint when maybe your state representative or even the mayor or I guess even your neighbor is like leading by the wrong example?
Mm-hmm.
How do you address that when they're leading from a place of rudeness or discrimination and you're trying to work around that?
Yeah, great question. And that's a hard one. So if you can get that person, the leader, to buy into the value of these kind of processes, sometimes like I had a mayor sitting in a dialogue group at one point, and she was being very dominant, and I am comfortable enough as a facilitator to just say, like, hey, mayor, everybody in this group has got to talk, and you got to just hold on for a second. But not everyone, like, not every mayor would do that, right? Like, there are a lot of public leaders that would just be like, I'm not doing this. So I think that if that's the case, that's hard, and you may want to see if your community can try to sort of show different models of decision making. Sometimes if leaders see different models, they can sort of learn by observing and maybe see, like, oh wow, like, in contrast to my meetings where everyone's really angry and screams at me the whole time, when that person held a meeting, like, people got along and, like, made a collaborative decision, and maybe that would be a better way to be. So, I think it can be like doing some advocacy for that kind of work. I mean, I think some of it may be also doing some grassroots, like, mobilization to try to elect a different leader next time, because some leaders are just not really open to collaborative processes, and I think that becomes tough because public leaders have to represent the whole community, including the perspectives that they don't agree with, right? And that's their job, and so I think that we need to hold them to it.
I think we're going to stop here because Quixada's going to meet some students after, so let's thank her again for a great speech.
Thanks, everybody.